Hey guys, tonight we descend into the endless green. You're not on a tour bus or flipping through a dusty book. You're waist deep in foliage swatting mosquitoes and trying to remember if that noise was a bird or something with more teeth. We're heading into the Amazon, where maps fade to watercolor and old explorers' notes start sounding like bedtime stories. The mystery on tonight's journey: lost cities. Real ones. Or maybe not. That's what we're here to figure out. People have whispered about ancient cities buried in the jungle for centuries. The kind with wide roads, tall walls, gleaming towers, and if you believe the bolder tales, more gold than sense. Sounds lovely until you realize you're the one with the machete and the questionable GPS signal. You probably won't survive this journey, if we're honest, but at least you'll doze off trying. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And I'd love to know, where in the world are you watching from? And what time is it over there now? Dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Your boots sink into the muck with a wet sigh. Cicadas scream from the canopy. Somewhere nearby, a monkey hurls a fruit with questionable aim. You push forward anyway, guided not by a compass, but by rumor. The rainforest smells like wet leaves, river mud, and 1,000 years of unanswered questions. You're not the first to wander into these woods looking for answers. Indigenous communities have lived here for millennia, navigating its tangled corridors long before the word Amazon was printed on any Western map. You, on the other hand, just stepped over a tree root and nearly face-planted into a line of ants, performing what appears to be a funeral procession. Even today, satellite maps struggle to make sense of the forest's shape. That's part of the magic and the menace. The jungle isn't just dense, it's actively hiding things. Ancient things, weird things, like perfectly straight lines carved into the earth giant fish ponds, too symmetrical to be natural, and mounds that hum underfoot like they remember being cities. Back in the 1500s, when conquistadors first bumbled their way downriver, they brought home wild stories, not just of gold, but of complex societies, towns with marketplaces, roads, and bureaucrats who probably argued about parking spaces. These tales were usually dismissed as heatstroke-fueled nonsense. After all, how could a rainforest host civilization? Historians still argue whether those early accounts were embellishments, outright lies, or accurate glimpses filtered through cultural ignorance. A friar in one of those expeditions wrote about towns with thousands of people connected by causeways. He also claimed he saw a monkey with a human face, so grain of salt. But then the rumors persisted. Oral traditions among tribes like the Quill mentioned vanished settlements and great structures swallowed by vines. Archaeological teams have stumbled on shards of pottery deep where no modern village exists. You wonder, what if the real question isn't were there cities, but how many, and why did they vanish? Beneath your hammock, something crunches. You freeze. Just a branch, maybe. Or maybe it's the jungle's way of reminding you people have disappeared, chasing these tales. And yet, you press deeper, because every good bedtime story needs its forest, its mystery, its monster, or in this case, its myth. And what could be more soothing than unraveling a centuries-old enigma by lantern light. You wake up to the sound of distant drums, or is it thunder? Hard to tell out here. Morning in the rainforest is loud, wet, and full of things that want to crawl into your boots. As you stretch, you remember your mission to follow the trail of those first Europeans who dared to chart this green labyrinth. Not all of them made it back. And those who did, they couldn't stop talking about what they saw. In 1541, Francisco de Orellana and his crew set out in search of cinnamon. Yes, cinnamon. The spice trade was serious business. But they didn't find a kitchen cabinet full of nutmeg. They found the Amazon River. The locals they encountered told stories of massive cities hidden inland, towns with stone structures, organized streets, and crops so carefully arranged it made European farming look like a toddler's sandbox. To the Spaniards, this sounded like a South American Atlantis. You too are skeptical, but also curious. After all, who brings back stories of giant populations and communal gardens unless they saw something? That's not a fever dream, that's urban planning. Some reports spoke of fierce tribes led by women warriors, the Amazonas, which of course is how the river got its name. Whether these women actually existed or were just products of Spanish bravado and a little gender-based paranoia is still debated. Historians still argue whether the tales were inspired by real matriarchal societies or invented to spice up travel journals. You cross a narrow stream, its banks littered with slick stones and curious frogs. The jungle looms on all sides, green and ancient. You can almost hear the echoes of conquistador boots of horses struggling in mud, of European steel clashing with dense undergrowth. Some of these adventurers went mad, others vanished. One soldier claimed to have seen a city with towers so high they scratched the sky. He also wrote about talking trees, so there's that. But if you squint through the lens of imagination and humidity, a pattern emerges. The reports, no matter how embellished, share common threads: agriculture, roads, large-scale organization. Not just scattered tribes, but whole societies with the hallmarks of civilization. Could they all have been lying? Or worse, were their accounts dismissed because no one wanted to believe that indigenous people could build something grand? The story gets murkier the deeper you go. In the 1600s, Jesuit missionaries added their own observations, talks of massive plazas and civic buildings, but their writings were often filed under colorful nonsense. For centuries, the dominant narrative held that the Amazon was too poor in nutrients, too chaotic to sustain permanent settlements. Yet you've just walked past a grove of fruit trees growing in eerie rows. You bend down and spot a fragment of pottery nestled in the soil. It's nothing fancy, just a shard, but it's old and it's man-made. That jungle drumbeat continues softer now. Or maybe your heart is just sinking with the rhythm of the forest. You start to feel it, the sense that something vast once breathed here. Not a city of stone, perhaps, but of rhythm, ritual, and ruin. And so you follow those long-gone conquistadors, not for gold, but for truth. One moss-covered footprint at a time. You paddle slowly, the canoe cutting through tannin-dark waters that reflect the sky like an old mirror. Around you, the rainforest closes in green upon green upon green, with just enough space for mosquitoes to dive bomb your ears. You're not here for birdsong or botanical diversity. You're here for El Dorado. Yes, that El Dorado, the Golden City, the shimmering lie, the fever dream that launched 1,000 doomed expeditions. You'd think people would have given up after the fifth or sixth skeleton-filled cave, but the promise was too dazzling. One explorer's myth is another investor's treasure map. By the late 1500s, the idea of a hidden city bursting with gold had spread like a rash across Europe. You're floating in the same waters that Sir Walter Raleigh once sailed, convinced he'd find a kingdom of untold riches somewhere in these woods. He didn't, but he did lose his son and his head eventually. Still, even failure couldn't extinguish the glow of El Dorado. The myth shifted over time from a king dusted in gold to a city, then to an entire region. The only constant was the desperation of those who hunted it. And now, here you are listening to your GPS hiccup as you scan the banks for any sign of treasure. Historians still argue whether the myth originated from real tales of prosperous jungle communities or was inflated by greedy ears. Indigenous peoples certainly had gold often traded from the Andes. They also had complex social systems, intricate art, and a baffling ability to thrive in conditions most colonizers couldn't survive without catching at least 3 tropical diseases. You pause to inspect a mound rising just above the tree line. It's oddly shaped, too geometric. Maybe it's natural. Maybe it's an ancient platform, once the base of a ceremonial center. You imagine torchlight drums masked dancers. Then a bug flies into your mouth and breaks the mood. The real richness here wasn't gold, it was knowledge. Agricultural techniques, medicinal plants, and ecological mastery that baffled European minds. But shiny things were easier to sell to kings. Of course, explorers weren't above stretching the truth. One claimed he found a lake where priests tossed golden offerings into the water. Another said he saw streets paved with emeralds. Another probably saw stars after 3 days of heat stroke and snakebite hallucinations. Even today, treasure hunters continue to search. You recall a recent case where someone used a drone to scan riverbanks for gold. They found an old beer can and a disgruntled caiman. Not quite the lost city of Z, but we all start somewhere. You lean back and squint at the sky. The canopy parts just enough for a single beam of light to hit the river's surface. For a moment, it gleams gold. And that's the thing. The jungle is good at playing tricks. It reflects what you want to see. If you're looking for ruins, every root is a wall. If you want riches, every glint is a coin. The only certainty is that no one ever found El Dorado, at least not the way they expected. Still, as your paddle dips once more, you wonder if the real treasure might be the questions left behind. The jungle opens just slightly, revealing a clearing with low, rounded mounds arranged in a pattern far too deliberate to be natural. You step ashore, brushing aside ferns that seem to lean in with gossip. Beneath your boots, the ground hums with a kind of history that hasn't yet been fully deciphered. You're not here for myths anymore. You're here for the real evidence, and it's lying just beneath the surface. As you wander between the mounds, something catches your eye. Fragments of red ceramic, faint etchings still visible, peeking out of the soil like shy artifacts. These aren't just leftovers from campfires. They're parts of storage jars, cooking pots, maybe even ceremonial vessels. Someone lived here long enough to leave a cultural footprint deep enough to withstand centuries of rain and roots. You look up. The trees seem younger here, Not by much, but enough to suggest that maybe this place was once cleared, maybe even cultivated. Suddenly, you see more strange ditches in symmetrical curves, like the ribs of a forgotten design. Historians still argue whether these earthworks served as defensive walls, ceremonial layouts, or some kind of communal farming grid. Whatever they weren't random. Nearby, you spot a tree with fruit dangling low, its skin a curious shade of yellow. Turns out, these trees don't just grow here, they were planted. Many of them are descendants of orchards laid out hundreds of years ago. They're the leftovers of a vanished diet. You press on and find another village site, this one more intact. Rectangular clearings, compact paths, charcoal-rich soil. You kneel and sift a bit of earth through your fingers. It's darker than it should be. Not just because it's old, but because it's engineered. Someone once knew how to make this soil richer, more fertile. A knowledge that was either lost or ignored for centuries. The tribal groups in this area, the Kwikoro, the Shingu peoples, they've long spoken of ancestral towns with structured streets and specialized roles. Their oral histories describe boundaries, leaders, rituals. These weren't scattered nomads. They were settled, sophisticated communities. You find a shard of black pottery with a lip shaped for pouring. Beside it, a shard of one painted red. Someone had a preference. Maybe even a collection. You smile. Even in the jungle, someone probably grumbled about mismatched dishes. The geometric earthworks become clearer as you climb a small rise. From here, the patterns stretch in broad arcs. Some spiral, others form squares. They're massive. Too massive to be the work of chance. Only visible fully from the sky, and only comprehensible if you know what to look for. The sun sets, slowly turning everything gold. You sit on a log that might once have been part of a longhouse frame and think about all the archaeologists who laughed at the idea of complex Amazonian societies, and the ones now quietly digging, slowly changing their minds. Some say these cities fell to disease brought by the very explorers chasing dreams of El Dorado. Others blame ecological collapse, infighting, or shifts in climate. The jungle doesn't offer explanations easily. It just reclaims. But the clues are here. Hidden under roots, wrapped in vines, scattered in fire-blackened shards. Enough to whisper that the jungle wasn't empty. It was edited. You unroll a crumpled map, the kind that looks more like a treasure hunt from a child's imagination than a tool of serious geography. At the center, in fading ink and cryptic symbols, is a single word circled with flourish Z. It's not a joke, not a comic book artifact. This was the obsession of Colonel Percy Fawcett, and it's about to become yours. Fawcett was no ordinary adventurer. A British officer, part Indiana Jones, part Sherlock Holmes, he ventured into the Amazon in the early 20th century, convinced that a great civilization, City Z, was out there. His notes were filled with precise coordinates, odd codes, and wild conviction. He believed the city would rewrite the story of the Americas. And then he vanished. You clutch your copy of his journal, a replica filled with phrases like a ruined tower covered in vines, and native rumors speak of white stone streets. It's just vague enough to be tantalizing, and just detailed enough to get you lost. Historians still argue whether Fawcett's City Z was inspired by indigenous tales, past expeditions, or his own increasingly unhinged imagination. Some say He drew on manuscripts describing massive jungle cities seen by early missionaries. Others suspect he simply yearned for a legacy beyond colonial paperwork. You hike through thick brush, retracing one of his many routes. Each step is a guess. Some rivers have changed course. Villages have moved. But the jungle, ever unbothered, remains nearly the same. Somewhere along the Rio Xingu, Fawcett disappeared with his son, and a friend swallowed perhaps literally by the land he so romanticized. You find a small clearing with traces of campfire. Maybe it's from recent explorers. Maybe it's older. Either way, you imagine Fawcett sitting right there examining his compass, sipping weak tea and whispering to himself, "I'm close." To this day, no one knows what happened to him. Bones were found claimed to be his, but analysis suggested otherwise. Some theories say he was killed by hostile tribes. Others believe he chose to stay seduced by the very society he sought. A few fringe thinkers imagine he found Z and simply refused to return. You crouch near a tree whose bark is marked with faded cuts. Could be animal claws. Could be a code. Your brain starts doing that dangerous thing, filling gaps with meaning. The jungle does that. It rewards belief and punishes doubt, usually with insect bites and hallucinations. In Fawcett's letters, he described the city as monumental in scale, with stone arches and immense plazas. But no one has found such structures. Yet, recent LiDAR surveys hint at symmetrical patterns hidden under the canopy, aligning uncannily with his supposed target zones. You stare up at the trees, now alive with twilight chatter, frogs, bats, something large and flappy. City Z, if it exists, may not be what he imagined. No glittering towers, no gold, but perhaps a network of earthworks, ceremonial sites, and homes stitched together by culture, not conquest. The real mystery, you realize, might not be Z itself, but the man who believed in it so fiercely, he vanished into legend. Night descends like a velvet curtain, muffling the world into hush. Your campfire crackles softly, casting flickering shadows on the mossy trunks around you. Somewhere nearby, a branch snaps just once. The jungle listens, as if waiting for you to ask the wrong question. You're near where Percy Fawcett disappeared, and it's hard not to feel it. You hunker down with your notebook, flipping through sketches, coordinates, speculative maps. All of it a spiderweb spun from a single obsessive mind. Fawcett wasn't the only one drawn to the legend of City Z, but few followed its trail so persistently or so blindly. He returned to the Amazon again and again, refusing to give up even as funding dried up and colleagues grew wary. His final expedition in 1925 was meant to be definitive. He brought his son, Jack, and Jack's best friend. No professional team, no backup plan, just a few men, a compass, and a dream that had started to swallow everything else. Historians still argue whether Fawcett's obsession was noble curiosity or reckless delusion. Did he truly believe he'd find utopia, or was he running from something, maybe both? The line between explorer and exile is always thin in stories like this. You examine a dented canteen, half buried in the dirt. It's not his, but the sight of it makes your stomach clench. How many have come searching since journalist thrill seekers, self-proclaimed psychics? Some found nothing, some found bones. Others never came back. One theory suggests Fawcett was killed by the Kalapalo people after a cultural misstep. Another claims he died of fever, buried in an unmarked grave beneath tangled roots. And then there's the theory, quiet but persistent, that he found what he was looking for and chose silence. You glance at the trees again. The moonlight filters through like a silver net. Are you safer here than he was? The jungle still swallows radios, still muffles satellite phones. One wrong step, and you could become another story whispered in expedition bars. You lie back using your backpack as a pillow. The night is warm, humid, heavy. Fireflies blink above you like erratic stars. You think about how many ancient cities were lost, not to war or natural disaster, but to time and silence. Maybe this place doesn't want to be found, or maybe it's waiting for someone who knows how to ask. The Amazon doesn't mark graves, it absorbs. Bones return to soil, fires are washed away by rain. If Fawcett died here, the jungle kept his secret well. You wonder what drove him to keep going. Maybe it wasn't glory or treasure. Maybe he simply couldn't live in a world where mystery had run out. You close your eyes, and for a moment you feel it, the weight of all those footsteps before you. Boots marching through mud journals clutch tight hearts full of hope and hubris. The jungle always wins. But oh, what dreams it eats. Dawn breaks slowly with shafts of misty light filtering through the canopy like sleepy searchlights. You sit beside the embers of your fire, sipping lukewarm coffee and staring at a mound nearby, low, moss-covered, unremarkable. But something about its shape, its symmetry, whispers of intention. You start to see the jungle not as an obstacle, but as a collaborator. You've been trained to think of cities in terms of stone walls, columns, domes. But here, in this breathing green expanse, architecture might not mean permanence. Maybe the forest wasn't just encroaching on cities. Maybe it was the city. Historians still argue whether the ancient societies here saw the forest as a canvas or a co-architect. Some believe the jungle itself was cultivated into urban form trees, selected and arranged for food, shade, medicine, even ceremony. You begin to suspect you're walking not through ruins, but through a living, evolving metropolis. The concept isn't new to indigenous people. For them, the land isn't separate from society, it is society. Roads once existed here, but they weren't cobbled stone. They were compacted earth, flanked by planted lines of palms. Walls, maybe rows of trees, trained to grow in arcs. Houses may have been timber frames designed to dissolve back into nature without leaving scars. You step carefully around a grid of strangely planted saplings. They're young now, but could be part of something much older, a ritual grove, a property boundary, or just an ancient garden that's reseeded itself for centuries. You remember one anthropologist describing these civilizations as invisible cities, not because they were imaginary, but because they didn't conform to colonial expectations. And so, they were ignored. Nearby, you spot a low causeway, just barely raised above the swampy ground. It's too straight to be random. You follow it and realize it connects two clearings, each bordered by trees of similar age and species. Coincidence? Not likely. You pause and run your hand along the bark of a nearby tree, its texture rough and familiar. The kapok, a sacred tree in many Amazonian cultures. Maybe this one was planted intentionally, its position marking something important like a plaza corner or an entry point. The forest around you hums with insects, birds, and the occasional monkey argument. You close your eyes and try to imagine what this place looked like when it thrived. No skyscrapers, no stone castles, but a city nonetheless, just one grown instead of built. This isn't just romantic speculation. Researchers now recognize that pre-Columbian Amazonians manipulated their landscape on an enormous scale. They didn't conquer the forest, they persuaded it, and the forest responded. You think again about Fawcett and his elusive city Z. Maybe he was looking for stone monuments when he should have been reading the trees. The jungle doesn't forget. It just doesn't write in stone. You lie in your hammock, swaying gently under the dappled green ceiling, your eyes following the lazy orbit of a dragonfly. It's a brief moment of stillness, but your mind is racing. Somewhere above you, far beyond the treetops, machines are humming drones and satellites mapping the forest with cold precision. That's where the next revelation is coming from the sky. In recent years, archaeologists have started using LiDAR, light detection, and ranging to peel back the canopy without touching a leaf. Mounted on planes or drones, it sends laser pulses to the ground and measures how long they take to bounce back. What it returns is a ghost map of the earth beneath the trees, and it's revealing things no one expected. Historians still argue whether these discoveries confirm ancient texts or demand entirely new narratives. What they don't argue about is the volume of surprises. Large geometric patterns, raised roads, circular villages arranged like constellations. Settlements previously invisible to the naked eye now appear with startling clarity on computer screens. You glance at your tablet, where one such LiDAR image glows softly. It shows a massive earthwork square. Within square, with roads leading outward like the rays of a sun. You zoom in. It's not just a one-off. Similar structures are popping up across southern Amazonia, connected by invisible threads. It's like someone dropped a constellation on the rainforest floor, then let time bury it. These aren't crude layouts either. The symmetry is precise. The scale is enormous. You trace one path with your finger and realize it stretches several kilometers, an ancient road wide enough for foot traffic, perhaps even processions. You imagine painted bodies walking with torches, chants echoing through the trees. Some of these designs mimic celestial alignments, solstices, equinoxes. You start to wonder, was this jungle not only shaped by human hands, but also by starlight? You pack up your gear and move toward one such site. On the ground, it's harder to perceive. Vines conceal edges, tree roots blur boundaries, but every now and then, a pattern emerges. A straight ridge here, a smooth depression there. The sky saw it all first. You're just catching up. The idea that the Amazon was once densely populated with interconnected settlements changes everything. It means that lost cities weren't anomalies. They were part of a broader civilization that thrived in harmony with the forest. And yet, you feel a kind of melancholy. These structures weren't abandoned dramatically like Pompeii or Machu Picchu. They faded, slowly, gradually, swallowed not by war, but by vines, rain, and forgetfulness. You rest under a fig tree, its trunk, massive roots like sculpture. You sketch a crude map in your journal, trying to link what you saw on the screen with what you feel underfoot. You've been walking on top of stories. The sky is no longer empty. It's become a mirror to the past. And it's only just beginning to tell its secrets. You kneel in the damp soil, fingers sifting through its grainy texture. It's darker here, blacker than the surrounding earth, softer, somehow richer. This isn't just regular dirt. It's terra preta Amazonian dark earth, and it's rewriting everything archaeologists thought they knew about how people once lived here. Terra preta isn't natural. It's engineered, made by humans who knew how to turn the thinnest rainforest topsoil into fertile ground that could sustain large populations. It's filled with charcoal bone fragments, broken pottery, and other organic remnants like a compost pile, but on an almost magical scale. You hold a pinch in your palm and imagine someone 1,000 years ago doing the same. Historians still argue whether terra preta was created intentionally as a large-scale agricultural strategy or was simply an accidental byproduct of dense semi-permanent settlements. Either way, it speaks of knowledge, deep generational, scientific. European colonists once believed the Amazon couldn't support cities because its soils were too poor. That assumption shaped centuries of thinking. But Terra Preta tells a different story. It says, we knew how to farm here. We knew how to live here. You just didn't ask. You spot another patch of it nearby, stretching like a buried ribbon beneath a grove of cacao trees. And beside it, more pottery shards, a broken spindle, even what might be a charred bone. This was once a kitchen. Or maybe a garden. Or both. The line between the two might have been blurred here. Some researchers now believe Terra Preta could cover as much as 10% of the entire Amazon basin. That's a lot of engineered landscape, a lot of memory locked in the soil. You begin to wonder, what if this was the real secret of the lost cities, not golden temples, but black earth? You dig a little deeper. The smell is faintly sweet, oddly comforting. A smell of time, of people cooking, planting, burning, burying. Life layered into soil. Nearby, your guide points to a mound underfoot. Old field, he says simply. It looks like nothing. But it's probably centuries old, a raised bed designed to keep crops out of floodwater, enriched with fish bones and ashes. You begin to grasp the scope. This was not jungle survival. This was jungle engineering. And what's more, the fertility of Terra Preta persists. It renews itself. Some modern farmers in the Amazon still seek it out, planting directly into the patches, amazed by the yields. It's the soil that refuses to forget. The more you study, the more you see these ancient scientists, not as primitive horticulturists, but as ecological architects. They understood not just how to grow food, but how to transform a challenging ecosystem into a sustainable home. You rise, brushing the dirt from your knees. A blue butterfly flutters past your shoulder, as if approving your discovery. Somewhere deep in the canopy, a toucan laughs or mocks, hard to tell. But beneath your feet lies proof. Not of cities made of stone, but of civilizations grounded in wisdom. The real monuments here aren't above ground. They're under your boots. You step carefully over a gnarled root, your boots sinking slightly into the loamy forest floor. Around you, the rainforest buzzes and chirps and drips with life. But all you can think about is how wrong the textbooks were. You're walking through a place that shouldn't exist, according to the historical canon of even 20 years ago. For centuries, the consensus was clear. The Amazon was a counterfeit paradise, lush, yes, but too poor in nutrients to support large-scale human civilization. Any people who lived here must have done so in small, scattered transient groups. But you've now seen the pottery, the terra preta, the geoglyphs, and you're not alone. A quiet revolution is taking place in archaeology. Researchers armed with LiDAR soil chemistry and a more open mind are beginning to rewrite the timeline. Historians still argue whether these sprawling Amazonian societies should be classified as cities or complex villages. But there's little doubt they were permanent, organized, and far more populous than previously believed. You pass another cluster of dark earth, another fragment of ceramic. Every step you take seems to contradict a former footnote. You recall reading how 16th century accounts from Spanish and Portuguese explorers described riverbanks lined with settlements, miles of them. These were once dismissed as exaggerations. Now, they read like road signs. The implications are enormous. If the Amazon once supported millions of people in dense, interconnected communities, that changes not just our understanding of South American history, but of urbanism itself. These weren't people who failed to invent stone temples. They chose materials suited to their world, wood, earth plant fire, and left an imprint far more subtle than marble columns. You duck under a low-hanging vine and find yourself in what might have been a plaza. The land is too level, too round. The trees form a ring, perhaps from seeds that once lined a gathering space. You imagine festivals, councils, laughter, maybe even teenage rebellion in the form of badly sung chants. Some academics resist this new paradigm. To accept it means admitting that indigenous peoples had a more advanced grasp of ecology and urban planning than colonizers gave them credit for. And that's a hard pill to swallow, especially for institutions built on centuries of assumed superiority. But the evidence keeps piling up. One Brazilian team recently found signs of grid-like road networks beneath the canopy, intersection storage mounds, and even canals. Not grand temples, but infrastructure. The kind that takes planning consensus and continuity. You pause at a stump covered in moss. It looks ordinary, but might have once marked the corner of a residence, a family's anchor in the forest. Maybe there was a bench here. Maybe someone used to watch the stars through the break in the trees above. And it hits you. Cities don't always need stone or concrete. They need people, memory, rhythm, intent. And those things are still here, humming softly under the canopy, stubbornly refusing to be forgotten. You take out your notebook and scratch a single phrase. They didn't vanish. We just stopped listening. You sip from your canteen as you rest beneath the shade of a wide-leafed tree, sweat dampening the collar of your shirt. Across the clearing, a group of Quikuro elders speak softly in their native tongue. Their presence isn't part of your data collection plan. It's something better. They've invited you to listen. So you do. They tell stories passed down through generations about towns made of wood and thatch, about great fish ponds, defensive ditches, festivals marked by firelight and song. There's no mention of gold, no lost temples gleaming in the sun. But there is continuity, a lineage of memory too often overlooked. Western historians have long preferred stones to stories. If it doesn't leave a monument, they say it can't be history. But here, memory lives in the mouth, not in marble. It's etched into language dance and planting rituals. Historians still argue whether oral histories can be trusted as historical sources. Some dismiss them as folklore, unscientific, and mutable. But what if the mutability is the point? These stories adapt like the forest surviving colonization disease, missionization, and still somehow speaking truth. You're shown a site nearby, a ring of raised earth once used for ceremonies. It's not on any archaeological map. No excavation teams, no labels, just knowledge, carried in bodies and breath. That's where we danced. 1. Elder says, gesturing to what looks like nothing more than a soft depression in the ground. Suddenly, you understand the scale of what's been missed, not just structures, but perspectives. These weren't lost cities. They were overlooked ones. You sit beside a young man, painting a ritual mask. He explains the colors, the symbols, the meaning behind each stroke. The mask isn't for tourists. It's for their ancestors, for memory. He tells you about a time when their people moved together between seasonal settlements, building and unbuilding with the rhythm of the land. You realize now, permanence here isn't measured in buildings, but in cycles. Cities came and went like seasons, and that doesn't make them less advanced, just differently calibrated, more responsive, more alive. One woman pulls out a beaded necklace and points to a pattern. That's a river, she says. That's a house. That's our story. You blink. It's all there in beads and thread. A map, a diary, a civic record. You're reminded of scholars who argue the Amazon had no history because it left no written documents. But you've now seen that the forest has its own kind of literacy, its language etched into pattern ritual and spoken memory. The Quikuro and other indigenous groups aren't just remnants of vanished cultures. They are descendants of complex civilizations, maintaining fragments of knowledge their ancestors once wove into the very landscape. You pack up your notes with new humility. Some answers don't come from ruins or scanners. They come from sitting still and listening. And you understand perhaps for the first time that the forest's secrets aren't just buried in the dirt. They're walking, speaking, living right in front of you. You find yourself wedged into a back row of a university lecture hall, well, virtually anyway. The screen in your hammock flickers with a grainy live stream as experts argue somewhat politely over the implications of new Amazonian research. The moderator tries to keep things on track. but it's like herding jaguars with a laser pointer. One camp insists we need to redefine city. If dozens of settlements interconnected by roads and causeways sustained populations in the thousands with organized labor, specialized roles, and managed agriculture, what else could we call that? It's urbanism, just not the stone and steeple kind. Others are more skeptical. There's no evidence of large-scale monuments. One scholar argues adjusting their glasses with the passion of someone who once studied aqueducts for 10 straight years. No writing systems, no palaces, no imperial expansion. Historians still argue whether our old categories are simply too narrow or if we're just clinging to them out of professional inertia. After all, if we admit the Amazon was home to complex civilizations, we also admit that our past assumptions were steeped in colonial arrogance. You type a question into the chat box. What if we've been defining civilization by its ruins, not by its resilience? No response. Too poetic, maybe. One archaeologist shows a 3D model of recently uncovered road grids, perfectly straight, symmetrical, spanning kilometers. Another flashes a LiDAR map, bright as an X-ray, revealing ring villages so uniform they could double as mandalas. Then someone quotes an old missionary report, long ignored, that described villages linked like pearls on a string. Suddenly, what once seemed myth becomes data. And yet debate continues. Should we call these sites cities or invent new terms that reflect their unique form? Does applying modern language to ancient landscapes do more harm than good? The room can't agree. You glance at your notes. Somewhere between raised causeways and ceremonial plazas, you've scribbled. Maybe the forest is the archive. Some panelists worry about sensationalism turning every mound into a cathedral, every myth into fact. Fair. But others push back. We've underplayed these histories for too long, says a Brazilian anthropologist. Let's err on the side of listening. You lean back, hammock creaking. Outside, a thunderhead rolls across the sky, darkening the canopy. The rain begins to fall, a slow, soothing hiss that blankets the forest in thought. The stream ends. You close your screen and stare upward. Rain pattering gently on the tarp above. So many scholars, so many data points, all orbiting one elusive truth. The Amazon isn't a void waiting to be filled with meaning. It's a palimpsest of lives that never really left. And maybe the question isn't whether there were cities here. Maybe it's whether we've finally learned how to see them. You awaken to a sky, the color of bruised fruit. Smoke hangs low in the air, acrid and unmistakable. Somewhere in the distance, the forest is burning. Again. The fire isn't natural. The Amazon has always had a humid resistance to flame. What you're smelling now is the result of chainsaws, bulldozers, and bureaucracy. You step outside your tent and watch ash drift like snowflakes. It's strangely quiet. No birdsong, no insects, just the sound of something ancient being erased. You hike to a nearby ridge and look out. A swath of jungle has been reduced to smoldering stumps, charred earth flickering pockets of ember. It's like seeing a page ripped from a manuscript before you could read it. Historians still argue whether this deforestation will obscure more evidence than centuries of overgrowth ever did. Satellite surveys, once hopeful, now show patterns disappearing beneath scars of agriculture and cattle pasture. You kneel in the ash, and find a fragment of pottery, half burned, faint design still visible. Someone once ate from this. Now, it sits in a landscape that's forgotten how to hold stories. You meet with a local environmental monitor, a soft-spoken man with a GPS unit and a machete. He shows you before and after images. Villages once suspected to be archaeological sites are now soybean fields. No markers. No protests. Just silence, industrial and efficient. Sometimes he says we don't even have time to scan them. You feel a cold knot in your stomach. LiDAR. Drones and careful listening were revealing a civilization. Now that civilization is being plowed under before we can understand it. Not hidden anymore, deleted. The irony is cruel. For centuries, the West claimed there were no cities here. Now, as proof emerges, the forest that held it is vanishing. It's as if history waited too long to whisper back. A fire engine trundles past its side covered in dust. Crew, blank-faced, with exhaustion. One of them glances at your notebook and shakes his head. Too late, he says. Maybe he's right. You return to camp, your boots leaving prints in ash. Even the smell is fading, replaced by something synthetic. You write down your thoughts quickly before they evaporate. They didn't vanish. We erase them again. Night falls, smoke muted and dull. You can still see a faint orange glow on the horizon, like a city, but the wrong kind. You lie back, heart heavy. The jungle feels thinner somehow. Its secrets still murmuring, but quieter now. And you wonder, how do you mourn something you only just began to know? Back at your base, you sit hunched over a laptop, surrounded by notes maps and bits of charcoal-smudged pottery. The forest may be burning, but your screen glows with possibility. LiDAR images load, one by one, pixelated ghosts of cities that once breathed beneath the leaves. You're piecing together an empire not with spades and shovels, but with data and digital light. The technology is breathtaking. A plane equipped with lasers skims the jungle canopy. It sends pulses of light that pass through the leaves and bounce back from the ground. Algorithms stitch together these returns into topographical maps, so precise they can spot a raised footpath hidden under vines. You zoom in on one of the maps. A perfect circle appears over 200 meters across. It's connected by straight lines to other shapes. Rectangles, causeways, water channels. You cross-reference it with an explorer's 18th century sketch. The outlines match. Historians still argue whether these patterns constitute definitive cities or something less. But when you see these alignments replicated across vast regions, the distinction becomes academic. What matters is that people lived here, in numbers, with coordination, with imagination. You overlay the LiDAR map with modern satellite imagery. A chill creeps up your spine. The site is gone. Cleared for soy or timber, it's impossible to tell. The only trace left is this pixelated relic in your folder tagged Scan 187, a ghost in a machine. You contact a Brazilian researcher who's working to catalog these sites before they vanish. She's seen hundreds of scans, some too faint to publish, others kept secret to prevent looting. We're racing against two clocks, she tells you. Destruction and indifference. You remember standing under the kapok tree, wondering if the forest was part of the city. Here on your screen, it's undeniable. The cities grew with the trees. Their forms echo botanical logic, fractal paths, circular courtyards, nodal centers. Urban design by chlorophyll. And now you begin to appreciate how fragile it all is. These aren't ruins built to endure stone erosion. They're traces of intention, soft footprints across centuries read only by those who know where to look. You switch windows, pulling up recent drone footage. A team flying over Acre State captured new geoglyphs, spirals, squares, a chevron pattern that no one can explain. Ceremonial, one voice says in the audio. Astronomical, says another, and then a third. We don't know yet. That's the part you've come to love most. The uncertainty, the delicious ambiguity that still surrounds these places. What were they doing here 1,000 years ago? Trading, worshiping, hosting community dinners with fermented yucca. You open your notebook and jot a final line for the day. Myth gives us direction, but LiDAR gives us detail. And somehow, the two aren't at odds. They're in dialogue. You're back under the canopy now, though the forest feels different. Not because the trees have changed, but because you have. What once seemed like just a sea of green now teems with quiet structure. You recognize the ancient roadbeds, the soil patterns, the slight rise of what was once a house. It's all still here, if you know how to look. You cross a shallow creek, stepping carefully on slick stones. The water glides over your boots and carries leaf fragments downstream. You think about time and how it too flows, leaving some things visible, others swept away. There's a place ahead you've been saving for last. A ring village rediscovered just 3 years ago via satellite. No signposts, no crowds, just you, your guide, and a clearing that once pulsed with life. The trees part as if by invitation, revealing a circular depression, perfectly symmetrical, lined with younger trees, like a green echo. You stand in the center and turn slowly. Everything about this place says design, not accident. You picture a communal longhouse here. People gathered to eat, tell stories, argue about canoe repairs. Laughter, drums, silence. Then more laughter. Historians still argue whether places like this were purely ceremonial or residential. You suspect the line was always blurred. After all, where better to live than in a space already charged with meaning? You sit down on a rock, sun-warmed and smooth. Your notebook is nearly full. Terra preta, under your boots. Butterflies orbit lazily, and in your mind a single thought surfaces. Again and again, these cities weren't just lost, they were remembered differently. The myth of the Amazon wild, untouched, empty was convenient, easier to justify conquest, deforestation, and erasure. But you've seen the evidence, heard the stories, walked the pathways. The jungle was never silent, just misread. A small breeze lifts a dry leaf and spins it like a compass needle. You imagine it's pointing you toward the truth that civilization doesn't always leave behind walls and thrones. Sometimes it leaves orchards, gardens, soil. As you rise to leave, fireflies begin blinking around the clearing. They flicker slowly like heartbeat Morse code. You watch them for a moment, then step quietly into the shadows, heart full. And you understand, now the Amazon's lost cities were never mythical. They were simply misunderstood. And so under the hush of rainforest twilight, with your boots damp and your mind full of voices from the past, we let the journey settle into quiet. The jungle doesn't offer endings. It simply softens the questions until they feel like dreams. Above the canopy sways gently, and the sounds of the forest become softer, like a lullaby composed in moss and leaf. Somewhere nearby, an owl takes flight without a sound. Fireflies trace soft golden loops in the dark, as if spelling out the old stories no one dared to write down. You've walked where others vanished, sat where voices once rose and songs now faded, touched the earth that remembers when cities breathed here not with concrete and clock towers but with rituals, laughter, and quiet brilliance. And as you close your eyes, let yourself imagine it all again. The painted masks, the ring-shaped plazas, the secret pathways only visible from the stars. Not fantasy, just another kind of history. One that listens more than it speaks. So breathe easy now. Let the weight of old mysteries melt into the hum of nighttime. The forest will keep its stories safe. You've heard just enough to drift, and yet even as lasers pierce the canopy and scholars redraw the textbooks, one truth remains hauntingly clear. The Amazon wasn't just misunderstood, it was mismapped. So now, to truly understand how belief shaped exploration and how imagination inked itself into reality, we must turn our eyes from satellites to scrolls. Picture this, a dim study lit by candlelight. You lean over a parchment map, fraying at the edges, smelling faintly of smoke and ambition. The forest disappears, replaced by rivers shaped like serpents, cities dreamed more than discovered, and names no one could pronounce. Let's step into the age where cartography was not just science, but seduction. You grip the fraying edge of a 16th century vellum map. It smells faintly of smoke and ink. Across its faded surface swirl fantastical rivers, mountains, like molars, and place names you can't pronounce. Some are real. Others you suspect were added by hopeful sailors or half-mad friars. One of them is unmistakable Manoa. Another simply says Z. This is how the mapmakers of the age worked with a mix of observation hearsay and a dash of fever dream. These early cartographers weren't Google Earth technicians. They were more like storytellers with a quill. If a Portuguese ship captain came back from the New World and claimed he saw a white city gleaming through the jungle mist, the cartographer didn't need a second source. He had ink. He had space on the map. Why not add it? Better to fill the void than admit ignorance. Blankness, after all, invited accusations of laziness or worse, heresy. It's easy to mock these old maps today, with their rivers that loop into themselves like spaghetti, and kingdoms named things like the land of giant ants. But to the people of the time, these charts were lifelines. They guided conquistadors, missionaries, pirates, and fools. And they didn't just chart land, they charted belief. You trace a river, drawn far too straight, flanked by cities every 50 miles, like someone measured with a ruler. Some of those cities existed, many didn't. But they were there in ink, and that made them real to the men who followed. Cartographic historian Matthew Edney once said that maps create the territories they claim to represent. In the Amazon, this was especially true. Explorers weren't just finding places, they were proving them into being. A dotted name on a map became a target for gold seekers. A false bend in a river might lure a fleet into weeks of starvation. Historians still argue whether the 16th century maps were gullible errors or deliberate lies. Some say they were cautionary placeholders. Here be monster zones meant to signal ignorance. Others believe they were sales pitches for colonial sponsors. Invest in this trip, and we might find Manoa. The irony. Some of those imagined cities may have been real after all, just not where or how Europeans expected. You step over a route and feel something carved beneath the mud, an ancient stone road. Not cobbled, but compacted earth, layered with charcoal and bone, designed to drain in rain and hold under weight. A city once stood here. Its map was never finished. And above, in a museum somewhere, a dusty globe spins, still missing its jungle metropolises. You're now holding another kind of map holder, more abstract. This one doesn't even pretend to show the world as it is. Instead, it's a mosaic of ideas, guesses, and ancient prestige. Ptolemy's Geographia. The gold standard of classical mapping didn't even include the Americas because it was written 300 years before they'd be discovered by Europeans. Yet well into the 1500s, explorers still clung to his coordinates like sacred scripture. Back in the 2nd century, Ptolemy tried something radical, calculating the Earth's circumference using math and sun shadows. He got it almost right, just not right enough. His maps stretched Asia so far east that Columbus thought he could reach it by sailing west. Oops. By medieval times, Europe had replaced Ptolemy's empirical pretensions with something far more theological. You unroll a TO map, the kind that monks loved. It's shaped like a circle, with a cross inside 3 continents, Asia, Europe, and Africa, divided by the Mediterranean and the Nile, all oriented with east at the top. Jerusalem sits dead center, as God surely intended. At the edges, paradise. Also dragons. These maps weren't meant to guide you from Paris to Peking. They were spiritual diagrams, devotional art, really. You weren't supposed to ask whether they were accurate. You were supposed to feel humbled. Geopolitical accuracy could wait. Still, the urge to know and to show persisted. Portolan charts appeared by the 13th century, primarily for sailors. Unlike their monkish predecessors, these maps were shockingly modern. Compass roses bloomed across them, like flowers radiating lines that made navigational sense. Coastlines, while exaggerated, hugged the real contours of the Mediterranean with eerie precision. But here's the catch. Portolans cared only about coasts. The moment you wandered inland, the accuracy melted like wax. Mountains, cities, rivers, all either vaguely placed or completely made up. You get the sense that the cartographer stepped back from the page and muttered, close enough. Still, people trusted them. After all, they had lines, straight ones. And that's persuasive. Some maps included animals, rhinos near India, elephants in Africa, and always a dragon somewhere inconvenient. These illustrations weren't decoration, they were warnings. Here be lions, here be icebergs, here be death. Of course, death might just be the unknown, but it sounded scarier in Latin. Historians still debate whether these maps deliberately misled or simply reflected what little anyone knew. Many were compiled by people who never left their desks, piecing together rumors from sailors who'd just survived malaria and scurvy, and a run-in with Portuguese tax agents. Not exactly peer-reviewed. One oddity, you'll find cities drawn with exaggerated towers. These weren't just architectural fantasies, they were symbols of significance. Bigger towers meant bigger political power. Or perhaps the mapmaker just liked castles, hard to say. And then there were Phantom islands that showed up again and again for centuries despite never existing. One famous example is High Brazil west of Ireland. It appeared on maps until the 1800s. Sailors looked for it. Some swore they saw it. That's the funny thing about belief. Once you map it, it's hard to unmap. You flip to a map from 1502, the Cantino Planisphere. It's a marvel with the newly found Brazil jutting confidently into the Atlantic. It's still mostly guesswork, but it looks plausible. That's the seduction. These early maps gave the illusion of knowledge, even when they got nearly everything wrong. You sit with that thought for a moment. How many explorers were led astray by maps that were beautiful lies? How many indigenous cities, real ones, were dismissed as jungle hallucinations because they didn't appear in Latin on some monk's parchment? Remember this: maps don't just reflect reality, they shape it. Now picture yourself on the deck of a creaking caravel, sails puffed by uncertain winds, and a horizon that promises gold god or gut-wrenching disappointment. It's the early 1500s, and you're not just mapping for curiosity's sake. You're mapping for the crown and for eternal salvation. This is cartography as conquest. You glance down at your charts. They're not scientific instruments, they're wish lists. The Spanish and Portuguese empires didn't need accurate topographies, they needed justifications. If a map showed a kingdom of gold just past that ridge, then it was worth sending men to die for it. Bonus points if the map included a cross, the souls to be converted, made the bloodshed feel righteous. These early maps were tools of empire, sometimes more weapon than window. You might draw a mountain range thicker to suggest a natural border, or invent a river to claim fertile land. Once ink dried, it became policy. You meet Martin Waldseemüller. Well, not literally, but his 1507 world map is here with you in spirit. It's the first to call the new continents America, named after Amerigo Vespucci, who arguably just wrote better press releases than Columbus. The map's detail is astonishing, given how little he actually knew. But it didn't matter. It was plausible. That was enough. Next to his map, you place a Spanish manuscript full of fantastical cities. There's one called La Gran Paititi, another Omagua. Both appear with roads and temples nestled in impossible valleys. They were real enough to send thousands of soldiers and missionaries blundering into green oblivion. And then there's the twist. Some of these cities did exist, just not in the form Europeans imagined. They weren't walled like Toledo or paved like Rome. They were spread out low to the ground, designed to breathe with the forest. Think less stone citadel and more eco-integrated urbanism. But to European eyes, anything without a spire or cathedral seemed primitive. And so it didn't make the map, or worse it did, but as a curiosity. You read labels like Village of Naked Cannibals and Land of Headless Men. These were places people lived, loved, farmed, fought, but to the cartographer, they were props in a colonial theater. Historians still argue whether these grotesque entries were fear-mongering or just bad anthropology. Either way, they reinforced the same message: this land needs us. You find a map by Sebastian Münster, 1540. His version of South America bulges in strange places, rivers looping like intestines, and Brazil is filled with creatures, some real, some mythical. There's a note near the Andes. Here great silver is said to lie. This was enough to fuel the nightmare that became Potosi. Again and again, you see how maps served the twin gods of empire, resource extraction, and moral justification. Show a city, conquer it. Show a blank space, fill it with settlers with missions with flags. And once a place was conquered, its old names were scraped off the parchment, replaced with saints and royals. Manoa might become Santa Maria del Lago. A jungle metropolis becomes a forgotten footnote because it no longer serves the mapmaker's master. Still, every now and then, a whisper remains. An old indigenous trail leads nowhere, except it doesn't. It leads to a place that once was, just not to a place anyone bothered to keep on the map. You're now slogging through mud, up to your ankles, every insect in the hemisphere apparently thrilled by your presence. This is the Amazon, vast and echoing, and somewhere out here, they said, was El Dorado, the gilded man or city or empire, depending on who was doing the dreaming. In the 16th century, the Amazon wasn't a mystery, it was a magnetic obsession. Spanish and Portuguese explorers believed, or at least wanted to believe, that massive civilizations lay hidden beneath its canopy. They heard tales from trembling locals about cities paved with gold temples so radiant they blinded, and kings who powdered themselves in gold dust. You know standard modest governance. You trudge alongside Gonzalo Pizarro, who in 1541 leads an expedition east of Quito into El País de la Canela, the land of cinnamon. His goals are fragrant spice and even more fragrant wealth. Spoiler, he finds mostly starvation. Men eat their own leather boots. Horses disappear mysteriously into stew pots. His second in command, Francisco de Orellana, eventually floats down the Napo and then the mighty Amazon itself. And it's during this trip that stories bubble up of dense populations along the riverbanks of giant cities and cultivated lands. Orellana believes he's seen a jungle Venice. His chronicler, Gaspar de Carvajal, describes towns that stretch for miles. Historians still argue whether Carvajal exaggerated or faithfully recorded what he saw. His writings describe populous, organized settlements, vast roads, and fierce resistance by locals. But later, expeditions saw only emptiness. Where did those people go? Did they exist? You pause and consider. What if they were real and died out quickly? Victims of European diseases they never knew existed. Entire civilizations crumbled before they could even be photographed, let alone charted. Meanwhile, maps were being drawn. They began placing cities along the Amazon cities that probably referenced Carvajal's tales stretched into legend. Omagua, Manao, sometimes marked with a church icon. Other times, a vague dot. These names sparked centuries of fevered search. As you swing a machete through imaginary vines, you realize something: the very idea of El Dorado was cartographic bait. It lured men deeper into the jungle. It justified expenses, armed ships, and moral horrors. If you believed a city of gold existed, then any atrocity along the way became just another toll booth. you find a curious map from the 1560s that places El Dorado on a Lake Parim. This lake didn't exist. It never did. But maps kept showing it over and over sometimes until the 1800s. It's hard to let go of a fantasy, especially if it's shiny. Even Walter Raleigh got swept up in it. In 1595, he ventured into Guyana, claiming he was on the verge of finding El Dorado. His account suspiciously lush. Scholars today raise eyebrows at how much he apparently saw in so little time. But once again, maps copied his locations. If Raleigh said it, someone inked it. You pause by a tree and notice the carved remnants of a stone terrace beneath. Maybe it was once a plaza, now a squirrel's kingdom. These sites often covered misattributed or ignored hint at something enormous. But back in Europe, the narrative was simpler. The jungle was a green void waiting to be filled, even when it wasn't. Now, imagine you're drifting down the Amazon itself, not in a modern boat, but in a creaky, half-rotted brigantine patched with desperation and palm fronds. It's 1542, and you're with Francisco de Orellana hurtling toward history on the current of a river no European had ever dared to map from end to end. You're lost in every direction. Orellana didn't plan this. He was supposed to rendezvous with Pizarro, supply the rest of the expedition, then return. Instead, swept by current and starvation, he kept going. The river would not let him turn back. So he surrendered to it. You watch his men sketch crude outlines as they float past vast riverbanks lined allegedly with bustling towns. Some structures seem built of stone, others rise on wooden stilts. Women and children appear briefly, then vanish into foliage. At night, fires blink along the shore, like an urban skyline filtered through vines. Gaspar de Carvajal, the chronicler of this journey, writes of cities and provinces by the water's edge. He names rulers, records attacks, and marvels at the apparent density of people in an area later declared uninhabitable. According to him, the river is not wilderness. It is civilization wearing green camouflage. Historians still debate how much of Carvajal's account is real, and how much was rhetorical embroidery meant to impress Spanish sponsors. But something in the record lingers the tone of awe. He did not describe savagery. He described complexity, commerce, culture, conflict. Perhaps he saw the very metropolises that would soon be swallowed by bark and mist. Cartographers back home didn't know what to do with this. The Amazon was massive, hard to conceptualize, let alone map. But Carvajal's words gave them something tangible. So they added towns to maps, gave them names, drew them in clusters with connecting roads. From thin journals came thick belief. You glance at a 16th century chart showing a straight river flanked by symmetrical dots, too neat, too hopeful. These weren't cities, as they were, but as Europeans needed them to be familiar, conquerable, worth financing. No room for ambiguous jungle hybrids of architecture and biology. Yet the journey was real. Orellana's boat really made it to the Atlantic. His men were near mutinous, blistered blind with hunger. But they lived, and their tale spread. Soon, maps began featuring Omagua and Manao, and sometimes even Amazonia, a name drawn from another tale on this same journey, which we'll get to soon. But for now, picture this: a solitary vessel moving through a liquid highway, unknowingly sketching the margins of lost cities onto the minds of distant kings. You squint through the heat shimmer, wondering what Orellana really saw and what we'll never be able to confirm. Maybe the forest took it all back. Maybe it just changed the wallpaper. Now the river narrows and the stories grow stranger. You're floating with Orellana and his men, still dazed from heat and hunger when arrows rain down from the trees. Not from men, but from women, they claim. Tall, strong, bare-chested, armed to the teeth, and shouting in a language thick with fury. Welcome to one of the oddest entries in the early Amazonian chronicles, the warrior women of the jungle. Carvajal calls them Amazons, borrowing the name straight from Greek myth. And that's where the confusion begins. Did the men really see a tribe of female fighters, or were they hallucinating or exaggerating, or just too proud to admit they were defeated by a co-ed defense force? Historians still argue whether the encounter was real, embellished, or a convenient narrative device. After all, nothing spices up your report to the king like a mythological throwback. And if the river was home to Amazons, surely it deserved to be named for them. Hence the Amazon River cartography by anecdote. Maps soon reflected this tale. Some show not just the river's new name, but also regions labeled Amazonia, peopled with drawings of helmeted women, sometimes wielding bows, other times lounging beside jaguars. The iconography veers between respect and exoticism, like a Renaissance fever dream on parchment. You flip to a 1570 map by Ortelius. There's a cluster of cities near the Amazon, and nearby, a small caption in Latin "Nation of Women" said to dwell here. It's vague, non-committal, but there. And that was enough to ignite further myth-making. But the fantasy didn't stop with warrior queens. Other early maps included tribes of white Indians, pale-skinned jungle dwellers, supposedly descended from ancient Romans, Phoenicians, or survivors of Atlantis. You know the usual suspects. One map even describes a group of dog-headed men. Another features giants. Some label these fantastical residents with Latin phrases that translate roughly to "untrustworthy informants told us this." You chuckle, but then pause. Even the outlandish entries came from somewhere, from encounters, mishearings, mistranslations. Maybe warrior women were simply female fighters in matrilineal societies. Maybe the white Indians were lighter complexioned groups from higher altitudes. Maybe the dogheads were just people with elaborate headgear and a cartographer who needed new spectacles. But once inked, the myths gained permanence. Maps spread them far faster than word of mouth ever could. From Lisbon to Leipzig, people gazed at these documents and nodded yes, of course. The jungle is full of wonders and monsters. This fueled not only curiosity but policy. If you believed there was a matriarchal empire in the Amazon, you might send priests, not just soldiers. If you thought there were hidden descendants of lost civilizations, you'd dig for treasure with a shovel and a Bible. And the cities, still there on the margins, still sketched vaguely, still half believed. You trace a map's flowing ink trail and realize it's not a record of knowledge, it's a record of want. Wanting gold, wanting myth, wanting order in chaos. You exhale. The rainforest exhales back. You sit now at an old oak desk, candle flickering beside you as a dusty scroll is unrolled with care. This is not a new map. It's a copy of a copy of a copy. And therein lies the trouble. One mapper's wild guess becomes another's foundation. Cartographic errors aren't always born from ignorance. Often, they're inherited like a genetic flaw in parchment. This is the age of copycat cartography. You peer at an elegant map from 1599, nobly inked, gorgeously colored. But it's riddled with inaccuracies plucked wholesale from older sources. Cities that never existed are precisely placed. Rivers curve identically, as if nature had agreed to the last guy's whimsy. Even mistakes the shape of a bay, the tilt of a mountain range reappear across decades, preserved like holy relics. You trace the cartographic lineage like a family tree of nonsense. A phantom lake appears in one map, then 6 others. A lost city is copied so many times it starts gaining features, towers, roads, a harbor. Eventually, it has more history on paper than some real cities ever will. Historians still debate how conscious this repetition was. Were cartographers lazy under pressure? Simply deferential to tradition? Probably a little of all three. But the outcome was the same: errors metastasized, growing more confident with each replication. This wasn't limited to the Amazon. The famous island of California, shown as separate from the mainland, haunted maps for centuries. You see it printed well into the 18th century, long after explorers had debunked it. Why? Because someone important had once drawn it that way, and questioning a master was frowned upon. You flip to another South American map, this one cluttered with towns named Maneo Omagua and Z. They form a kind of constellation, unreal, but consistent. Their repetition gave them weight. If 5 maps agree, who's to say otherwise? But the truth was, mapmakers often worked far from the lands they charted. They relied on second-hand reports, many garbled by distance language and imagination. One explorer's tale of a broad clearing with rows of fruit trees might be translated as civilized agriculture with stone-lined streets. Add a priest who swears he heard drums in the distance, and voila, a city. You spot a curious note scribbled in the margin of a 17th century atlas, based on earlier manuscript, origin unknown. That unknown manuscript becomes gospel once copied. It's the ancient equivalent of citing Wikipedia citing itself. There's a beauty to this recursion, but also a sadness. Real places were ignored or overwritten, while fanciful ones grew roots on paper. Entire indigenous settlements, real vibrant complex, vanished under European eyes simply because they weren't dramatic enough for a cartographer's legend. And once a map was printed, it became very difficult to argue with. Paper, after all, doesn't talk back. If a Portuguese merchant said, "But there's nothing there," the response might be, "Yes, there is. It's right here in red ink." You set the map down, aware now of its ghost stories. It's a palimpsest of hopes, fears, and editorial flourishes, some charming, some chilling. And in a drawer, beneath another blank chart, waits. Who will fill it? And with what kind of truth? The scene shifts now, and you're in a chapel deep in the jungle. It's not much, just a wood-beamed roof, clay walls, and a handbell rusted by humidity. Yet outside this humble building, the scent of tamarind trees mingles with the slow smoke of cooking fires. Children laugh. A teacher chants in Latin. You're in a Jesuit mission, a reduction one of dozens sprinkled across South America like fragile pearls in an emerald sea. In the 17th and early 18th centuries, Jesuit missionaries were among the few Europeans to map the interior with any detail or curiosity. They weren't conquistadors, they were cartographic ethnographers of a sort. Their maps show rivers that actually exist, villages that correspond more or less to real coordinates. The priests walked paddled and documented. They asked questions. Sometimes they even listened. But here's the twist. These maps didn't last. You examine a Jesuit reduction map from around 1700, and it's strikingly modern. Roads link villages. Agricultural zones are marked. Even elevation is considered. It feels like the work of someone who saw the Amazon as home, not frontier. And perhaps they did. Many Jesuit missionaries spent decades here mastering languages, fostering local autonomy, even resisting colonial enslavement systems. Historians still debate whether the reductions were utopias or subtle cages. They offered structure, but often at the cost of tradition. Still, for a time, they functioned like little city-states, some housing thousands of people, complete with orchestras, schools, and even printing presses. You scan another map and notice the odd absence. These Jesuit-documented cities don't appear in later Spanish or Portuguese atlases. It's not that they were destroyed, though some were. It's that they were politically inconvenient. In 1767, the Jesuits were expelled from Spanish territories. Their missions were abandoned, their records seized or burned, and their maps largely erased from imperial consciousness. Some were recopied without attribution, others quietly lost. The jungle was remystified, cleansed of order and structure to make way for new colonial myths. One map from the late 1700s, made by secular authorities, shows the same region as blank again. Blank, as if the roads and plazas had never existed. As if thousands of people hadn't sung in choirs and harvested maize in neat rows beside the river. You run your fingers across that empty space and feel the ghost grid beneath it. It's not just that maps reflect power, they enforce it. To erase a people's city from a map is to deny their place in history. And so many of these indigenous Christian hybrids faded from memory. Their physical ruins remain sometimes buried beneath vines, sometimes mistaken for natural formations. But on paper, silence. And yet occasionally, an archive opens. A Jesuit diary surfaces, a fragment of a map folded inside a hymnal. These offer glimpses of what once thrived under the forest canopy, not wilderness, but woven civilization. You hear the echo of a choir, faint and in a tongue half Spanish, half Guarani. It's a song no longer mapped. You've arrived at a new kind of map room. No monks, no monarchs, just astronomers and naturalists squinting through lenses and scratching calculations into ledgers. Welcome to the Age of Enlightenment, where science is the new faith, and maps are meant to measure, not mythologize. It's the late 1700s and early 1800s now. Empirical observation reigns. Expeditions set out not with conquistadors, but with botanists, geologists, surveyors. The goal is not gold, it's knowledge, or so they say. You're aboard a ship with Alexander von Humboldt, a Prussian polymath whose curiosity is matched only by the weight of his notebooks. He travels through South America, scribbling furiously about barometric pressure, strange animals, and crucially, the land itself. He maps elevation by color gradient. He records plant distribution by latitude. It's dazzling and wildly influential. His maps seem a world apart from those of the Jesuits or conquistadors, and yet they carry their own biases. Humboldt, for all his brilliance, still describes parts of the interior as almost entirely uninhabited, despite walking through paths used for centuries. You see a curious paradox emerging. The more scientific maps become, the more they pretend neutrality. But this is illusion. Even these maps make choices what to label, what to measure, what to ignore. Rivers are charted, but oral roads, the ancient memory paths of indigenous guides, are omitted. Cultivated lands that don't resemble European farms are marked as jungle. Historians still argue whether Enlightenment-era cartography clarified or concealed. Did it bring accuracy, or did it just replace one kind of imagination with another? One moment from Humboldt's journey stands out. He meets indigenous people who describe a network of old causeways and mounds in the forest. He notes it, but doesn't fully believe it. After all, it doesn't match the Enlightenment model of primitive simplicity. No stone temples, no columned plazas, just dirt, raised with precision. You examine another map from the early 19th century. It's clean, sparse. South America's interior is now a zone of elegant minimalism, like someone pressed delete on centuries of myth, but forgot to insert the truth. But these maps too traveled. They ended up in universities, museums, colonial offices. They shaped the curriculum. They became the new orthodoxy. And in them, the dense Amazon settlements described by Carvajal, lived in by countless tribes, documented by Jesuits, are simply not there. You wonder, is a map more dangerous when it lies flamboyantly or when it lies by omission? Some of these Enlightenment maps even removed features from older ones. Cities labeled Omagua or Manao disappear. In their place, blankness. Maybe a river. Maybe a forest icon. But no people. No story. The jungle becomes a void again. Scientifically sanctioned this time. And so the myth of the untouched wilderness takes root, fertilized, not by fantasy, but by academia. It will linger for centuries, reinforced by explorers who walked ancient roads and called them animal trails. You step back from the map and see it for what it is, not a truth, but a lens. A beautifully crafted blindfold. Now picture the Amazon from above, not from the crow's nest of a ship, but from the gondola of an airship. It's the late 19th century, and you're drifting lazily over the treetops, suspended in a hot air balloon, or the nascent glory of a dirigible. Below, the jungle rolls like a shaggy green ocean, and through that verdure, faint lines appear, lines too straight to be rivers, too ordered to be natural. This is the era of aerial illusions and optimistic misreadings. As air travel begins to flirt with feasibility, a new perspective emerges, the bird's eye view, and with it, a renewed belief that something structured, something urban, lies hidden beneath the green. You clutch a pair of brass binoculars. Through the haze, you spot what looks like roads, parallel earthen ridges slicing through the trees. Or are they? Maybe they're animal trails. Maybe they're optical illusions. The airship lurches and the view shifts. You squint again. Travel journals from this period brim with excitement about prehistoric highways, jungle avenues, and lost boulevards. Victorian explorers gentlemen with too much time and not enough skepticism report sightings of ancient causeways, sunken plazas, even stone embankments. None of it matches what traditional archaeology teaches, and yet the stories persist. Historians still debate whether these early aerial observations were wishful thinking or genuine glimpses of something real. Some scholars dismissed the reports outright, blaming pareidolia, the human tendency to see patterns where none exist. Others archived the sightings, then forgot them. But you begin to notice a pattern. Multiple airship accounts describe similar features in the same regions. In Bolivia, in Brazil's Acre State along the Purus and Xingu rivers, grids mounds concentric circles. Not proof, perhaps, but smoke that suggests fire. And then come the forgeries. One famed map from this era shows a massive complex in the Mato Grosso labeled Z. It's based entirely on a manuscript left by a reclusive German explorer who claimed to have seen pyramids in the jungle. The document conveniently disappears. The map remains. You flip through an explorer's sketchbook from 1893. It's charmingly bad. His temples look like teapots. His road is just a river he mistook from a moving platform. But between the misfires, there's one drawing that gives you pause, a layout of what could be raised fields etched with precise cross-hatching. Even more tantalizing are reports of pottery shards found where there shouldn't be any, and charcoal layers beneath the trees, signs of long-ago fires, perhaps from human cooking, not lightning. Evidence without context, footprints in fog. These observers didn't lie, but they also didn't quite know what they were seeing. They lacked the tools, the training, and the permission from academia to claim that ancient civilizations once thrived here. So their reports were treated like adventure fiction. You return your gaze to the sky. Imagine floating across 500 miles of forest, seeing nothing but green, then suddenly catching a glimpse of geometry. A square clearing, a road too straight, a mound shaped like a star. The mind leaps, the heart follows. That leap, for a time, was enough to rekindle belief, but not enough to convince the institutions. So the jungle cities remained airborne real to those who believed, invisible to those who held the maps. Now, you're peering through a screen, not a telescope. It's the 21st century, and the jungle lies beneath your fingertips, not a forest of leaves, but of pixels. You're using LiDAR light detection and ranging, and with a few clicks, the canopy vanishes. What remains beneath is astonishing. Gone is the lush confusion of branches and ferns. Instead, an ancient geometry emerges. Grids of roads, circles of earthworks, raised platforms and canals. These are not random clearings. They're planned spaces, urban spaces. The jungle long thought untamed turns out to have been tailored. You stare at one region in Brazil's Acre State. Dozens of geoglyphs, enormous geometric ditches carved into the earth dot the landscape. Squares, rings, intersecting lines. Some are 300 meters across, too vast for gardens, too precise for natural formations. They were invisible until LiDAR stripped the forest bare. For decades, these shapes had been guessed at from the air, But it took LiDAR to confirm their scale and consistency. You can now map hundreds of square kilometers in days. The jungle's green disguise has met its match. Historians still argue over what these geoglyphs were. Ceremonial plazas, defensive structures, elite housing zones. Theories abound, but no one denies they are real and widespread. Elsewhere, LiDAR reveals buried roads radiating from central hubs like spokes in a wheel. You trace one that runs for 10 kilometers straight as an arrow linking what were likely settlements. Some of the routes are raised proof that the builders understood drainage. Jungle engineering done with wood and bone tools. This isn't just isolated architecture, it's city planning on a massive scale. In one study region of southern Amazonia, researchers estimate as many as 1,000 interconnected settlements may lie undiscovered. That's not a village network. That's a civilization. And yet none of this appeared on the maps we've studied until very recently. The technology simply didn't exist. Without LiDAR, the forest hides everything. Roads become route lines. Walls become termite mounds. Memory becomes moss. You think back to Orellana's journey, his reports of dense populations lining the Amazon, dismissed for centuries. Maybe he wasn't hallucinating. Maybe the evidence was just waiting for the right frequency of light to be believed. Even now, only a fraction of the Amazon has been scanned. Vast regions remain untouched by LiDAR's gaze. They are in the truest sense blank spaces on the map. But now we understand blank doesn't mean empty. In a university lab, a LiDAR scan is rendered in 3 dimensions. A technician zooms into what looks like a flat patch of forest and reveals a causeway, a staircase, a trench. The jungle coughs up its secrets pixel by pixel. You lean back from the screen. You're not looking at fantasy anymore. Not myth. Not hearsay. These cities existed. And now, finally, they're being mapped. Now you kneel in rich black soil that clings to your fingertips like coffee grounds. It smells oddly sweet, almost fertile in a way you can't describe. This is terra preta, literally black earth, and it may be the most quietly revolutionary clue in the entire Amazon. Unlike the acidic, nutrient-poor soils that dominate the rainforest, terra preta is astonishingly rich. It teems with life. Plants love it. Farmers today still seek it out, but it's not natural. It's engineered. Long before Europeans arrived, indigenous Amazonian cultures created this soil. They mixed charcoal bone compost and broken pottery, yes, pottery, into the earth. The result was a soil that doesn't erode with rain, holds nutrients for centuries, and may even regenerate over time. A prehistoric miracle grow. You lean closer and see shards of clay poking through remnants of ancient life. Fish bones, cracked manioc roots, maybe even a doll's head. This was domestic soil, lived-in soil, and it's everywhere. Historians still debate how widespread terra preta really is, but recent studies suggest it covers areas as large as modern countries. Some estimates go as high as 10% of the Amazon basin. That's not a scatter of backyard gardens, that's the footprint of mass agriculture. And here's where the story flips. If the land was engineered for sustained farming, then it had to support a stable, sizable population. You don't make terra preta for nomads. You make it for neighborhoods. One scientist grinning in the tropical sun once said, "The forest is partly man-made." It's a staggering thought. The Amazon, our global symbol of untouched nature, may actually be one of humanity's oldest landscaped spaces. The jungle grew around cities, not over wilderness. You think back to those early maps, the blank interiors, the wild guesses. If only they'd drawn arrows pointing underground. European settlers didn't recognize terra preta for what it was. They saw dark patches of soil, thought them curious, then built cattle ranches over them. It wasn't until the 20th century that the soil scientists began to realize these were the legacies of a complex agricultural tradition. Even today, researchers struggle to replicate terra preta in labs. It resists quick synthesis, as if guarding its secret. Yet it continues to nurture plants wherever it's found. You imagine the hands that created it adding ash-stirring charcoal planting cassava. This wasn't incidental innovation. It was sustained communal and deeply ecological. And it worked. More and more, these patches of black earth appear near LiDAR-detected structures. Not beside them, within them. These were not farming outposts. They were cities that farmed. Green cities, long before we coined the term. And yet these cities never made it onto the maps. Their streets had no stones. Their houses left no columns. Their agriculture was soil deep, not monument high. You run your fingers through the dirt again. It's not just fertile. It's a record, a map of life etched into the earth, waiting centuries to be read. You're crouched now in a lab, chilled by humming equipment staring at thin slices of ancient wood under a microscope. To your left, a paleobotanist adjusts a tray of pollen samples. To your right, a dendrochronologist counts growth rings like tree-age tarot cards. This isn't jungle exploration, it's jungle forensics. Welcome to the slow, detective work of reconstructing ancient Amazonian civilizations. No treasure chests or glowing relics here, just microscopic pollen grains, carbon layers, and isotopic fingerprints. And yet this evidence might be the strongest we have. You examine sediment cores drilled from lake bottoms near suspected pre-Columbian settlements. Each layer is a snapshot of the past. Charcoal from controlled burns. Phytoliths, the silicate skeletons of plants. Traces of manioc maize, squash crops that require planting storage and people. Lots of people. These signs repeat across the basin. Patterns emerge. Agricultural rhythms, controlled forest burns. Then suddenly, interruption. Around the 1500s, a steep drop in these indicators. It coincides chillingly with the arrival of Europeans and the diseases they brought. Historians still argue how many people lived in the Amazon before contact. Some suggest 2 million, others over 10 million. The margin of error is vast, but one fact isn't the collapse was swift and catastrophic. Smallpox, measles, flu viruses with no jungle analogs. In some regions, populations may have declined by 90% within decades. Villages were emptied, fields untended, roads reclaimed by vines. And when later explorers came, they saw only forest. You pause over a graph showing tree ring growth surges. It suggests that large swaths of land suddenly stopped being cleared or farmed. The trees grew freely for the first time in centuries. The jungle didn't expand, it rebounded. You flip through pollen maps. In many Mays, pollen disappears from the record post 1600. Alongside it, charcoal traces vanish. Controlled burns ceased. Fire returned to being wild. And so the scholarly debate rages: did these people live in dense centralized cities or sprawling low-density clusters? Were they permanent towns or seasonal hubs? Did they leave by choice, by force, or by contagion? One school of thought argues for garden cities, places designed to harmonize with the forest, not dominate it. No great pyramids, no imperial boulevards, but rather communal mounds, ceremonial clearings, intricate land use patterns, invisible to those who expect stone walls and plazas. Others remain cautious. They warn against reading too much from too little. The Amazon eats evidence. Mud buries it. Rain blurs it. Time distorts it. Still, piece by piece, the case builds. And now, with each new pollen core, each tree ring sample, the picture clarifies. This was not virgin forest. It was a tended, storied land echoing with life. You glance again at the wood slice. The rings are tight, then suddenly wide. A year of plenty. A shift in rain. A fire. A silence. The jungle remembers, even if the maps forgot. Now, you stand in front of a museum exhibit that doesn't exist. Behind the glass, nothing. No maps, no names, no dates. Just a blank wall and a plaque that reads, "Here might have been remembered the cartographers of the Amazon." It's not a curatorial error, it's a metaphor. Because among the many things erased from maps of the Amazon, perhaps the most tragic is this: the knowledge of indigenous mapmakers themselves. Not the Europeans hunched over parchment, but the locals who navigated, remembered, and conveyed terrain through story, song, and memory. You follow a trail deep into the forest, guided not by compass, but by an elder's murmured directions. Left at the fallen Saba, past the singing stone, cross the river where the heron sleeps. This is mapping, but oral, embodied, contextual, and it worked flawlessly for thousands of years, but it was never committed to paper. And so to colonizers, it wasn't real. When missionaries arrived, they often demanded the local names for places only to discard them later in favor of saints and kings. Whole regions were renamed, sometimes intentionally, sometimes accidentally. Manoa might have once been Manawa. Z might be shorthand for something long lost in translation. Historians still argue whether any fragments of indigenous geography survive in modern maps. Some river names linger, but their meanings are often misrecorded or forgotten. You read an account of a Jesuit who transcribed native songs describing a journey across tributaries. The original manuscript is gone, burned, lost, or left behind. You imagine an Amazonian cartographer, a person whose map is in their feet, their memory. Who knows the taste of the river? At certain bends, the tilt of a path. After rain, the call of birds as a compass. That kind of map dies quickly when no one listens. Colonial powers not only failed to preserve these systems, they actively suppressed them. Indigenous languages were banned in many mission schools. Oral histories were deemed pagan or unreliable. Generations were taught to forget the routes their ancestors had walked for centuries. The result, not just cultural loss, but navigational amnesia. Roads faded into the underbrush. Trade paths vanished. Sacred sites became random clearings. What once had names and stories now had GPS coordinates and silence. And when later cartographers came, they mapped what they saw. Or rather, what they didn't see. No cities, no plazas, no roads. Therefore, wilderness. You run your fingers across a map that labels an entire quadrant unexplored. Not unknown to us, just unexplored. A quiet erasure of the people who lived and died there, whose maps weren't made of ink, but memory. The tragedy is double. Not only were their maps lost, but the idea that they had maps was lost too. You close your eyes and try to walk a path you've never seen. You listen for the bird call that says turn right. You wait for the wind to tell you which hill has the well. But the voices are faint now, fainter every year. The forest is full of ghosts, not of cities, of memory. You return now to the jungle where the sun splits through the canopy in soft, dusty beams, and the air holds a kind of breathless stillness. You've walked in circles for hours, perhaps days, and yet the forest around you feels newly alive, because now you know where to look. A guide waves you over an archaeologist with a sun-scarred notebook and LiDAR scans stored on a half-charged tablet. She shows you a clearing where a mound rises subtle but deliberate. This isn't a hill, it's a plaza, or the ghost of one. Nearby, buried beneath centuries of rot and root, are post holes, evidence of large wooden structures, homes or meeting halls built with care and symmetry. The team is careful. No bulldozers, just trowels, brushes, and time. They uncover shards of painted pottery, worn grinding stones, and carved figurines. All the while, the forest watches as if amused. You remember this place swallowed cities whole, then let them sleep. But now, explorers come not with swords or scriptures, but scanners and questions. And slowly, the forest yields. Historians still debate how many cities remain unfound. Some think there could be hundreds. Others suspect thousands. After all, LiDAR has only touched a sliver of this biome. What lies beneath the rest? And what if some cities have left no trace at all, built in ways we don't yet understand? Erased not just by time, but by misrecognition. You walk a causeway that once linked neighborhoods. It's nearly invisible, except for a line of trees growing just a little straighter. You spot terra preta beneath your feet, black soil mixed with forgotten history. It crumbles like cake, feeds the jungle still. And then the map appears not on paper, but in your mind. A city spread across kilometers, not with stone, but with rhythm. Roads of dirt, neighborhoods of thatch, culture written in song and ash. Modern archaeologists sketch a new narrative, one of urbanism without monuments, sophistication without marble, cities that breathed with the forest not against it. And you wonder, what if this is the model of the future, not just the past? You return to your map, the new one. It's no longer blank. It pulses with questions, with new symbols. Not dragons, not El Dorado, but footpaths, farms, hearths, lives. Somewhere nearby, a bird sings the same melody. It's sung for 1,000 years. Somewhere beneath your feet, an old road waits. The jungle is not a void, it is a veil. And behind it, the cities wait, patient, patterned, and real. So now, as we slow our pace, let your thoughts drift like that long river, winding through centuries of silence and rediscovery. Imagine the way vines curl over temples, like fingers reclaiming a secret, or how stone paths remember footsteps long after the feet are gone. You're no longer holding a map. You are the map. Your imagination has walked earthen roads, floated past phantom settlements, and traced the outlines of cities drawn in soil and song. The Amazon, once dismissed as a green void, now whispers of empires that bloomed and faded beneath the trees. Feel the weight of old ink, drying on parchment, the soft crunch of terra preta underfoot, and the quiet insistence of voices who marked geography not with borders, but with memory. Let the old stories of Omagua and Z settle like mist, not to confuse, but to comfort. Not all things need to be found to be real. Now picture the forest again, its green expanse not as emptiness, but as a library with no shelves, only leaves. A place where history hums low, like cicadas in dusk, waiting to be heard. Let your breath slow, matching the rhythm of trees. Let your thoughts soften like riverbanks in flood season. You've traveled far through centuries, through myths, through truths rediscovered. You've mapped not just the jungle, but the way we see it. And now, with eyelids heavy and curiosity fed you, may close your eyes knowing the forest remembers even if the maps forgot.